This story began in April 1999. At the time, I worked as a nurse at a local hospital. It wasn't long before I had separated from my husband. We had only been married for a short 3 years. Donald was a hardworking man who didn't drink, but he was incredibly thrifty. His entire paycheck went into undisclosed bank investments. It seemed to me that he was comforted by the mere thought of having money, and his life's purpose revolved around increasing that bank balance. We lived frugally, surviving on my income. I used to put in a great deal of effort to feed and clothe us. At first, I held on to the hope that Donald was saving for our family's future, but on one occasion, when I broached the topic of having a child, he exclaimed in horror, "Catherine, we can't even make ends meet for the two of us. And you're thinking of having a baby? How are we supposed to live when you go on maternity leave? You're the one who's working." I was taken aback and asked, "Can't you support our family?" He responded, "I work to save money, not spend it. Don't even think about touching my savings. It's for a rainy day, not for frivolous expenses." I was shocked that he considered a child to be a frivolous expense, but I kept quiet. Shortly after that conversation, his mother fell seriously ill. Even then, Donald didn't withdraw a single cent from his account to help with her treatment, claiming that they didn't have enough money. It was at that moment that I realized I couldn't live with this man, even if he multiplied his wealth at the expense of people's health. I used some of my own money to help his mother get the necessary medication, and I packed Donald's things while he looked on in bewilderment. Let him decide whether it's a rainy day for him or not. Thankfully, my grandmother had left me the apartment, so I was the one who had to leave. The divorce was relatively straightforward, but my heart weighed heavy. When I got married, I had dreamt of a close-knit family, children, and a husband who would be the breadwinner, a pillar of support. However, living in a small village and working at the district hospital meant I had to spend an hour commuting to work. It was inconvenient, to say the least. On that Tuesday, I arrived for my shift as usual, but my spirits were far from lifted. The divorce was still on my mind, and the shift had passed quietly. I was getting ready to head home when they brought in a new patient. The man was unconscious, and his entire face was smeared with something black. Most importantly, they had brought a little frightened girl, about 4 years old, with him. Someone mentioned that they had been rescued from a fire in a nearby village. There was no one to leave the girl with, and it seemed like we needed to contact the police or find a place for her. She didn't seem to have a mother, and it was uncertain whether her father would survive. I approached the girl, gently stroking her disheveled, light hair. She raised her dirty face to me, and I was taken aback. The girl felt strangely familiar, even though I knew I had never seen her before, and I had never visited the village from which they had been brought. Suddenly, the little girl clung tightly to my leg and began to cry, saying, "Auntie, I'm scared. Don't leave." I was perplexed. What should I do? My shift was over, and I needed to go home, but I couldn't bring myself to leave this girl here. I approached the head nurse of the department and said, "I'll take the girl home, and when the man recovers, he can come get her." The head nurse pondered for a moment and waved her hand, saying, "All right, and if anything comes up, I have your address." And so, it was decided. The girl held onto my hand tightly as if she was afraid of getting lost. She didn't cry and didn't say a word. She just walked beside me. When we arrived at my home, I bathed her, wrapped her in my fluffy robe, and cooked some porridge. The little girl, named Carolina, eagerly ate and quickly fell asleep on the couch. I covered her with a blanket, then went over to my neighbor's house, who had a slightly older daughter, and asked for some clothes for her. My neighbor gladly gave me a whole bag of clothes. When Carolina woke up, she got dressed and started asking me about what had happened to them. She said, I was asleep, and my daddy grabbed me and carried me outside. Then he went back into the house. The house was burning, Catherine. You know, it was burning so beautifully, but it was so scary, and I was scared for my daddy. Then, my daddy ran out of the house, and something heavy fell on his head. Martin, our neighbor, called the firefighters, but the house still burned down. In a soft tone, I asked, "Carolina, did your mommy go somewhere?" Daddy said she went to the sky because she was very beautiful, a long time ago, when I was very little, only 2 years old. You were very beautiful too. Just don't go to the sky, okay? Because Daddy is sick, and I don't want to be alone. I smiled sadly and hugged her tightly, saying, "I promise you, I won't go anywhere, and you won't be alone. Your dad will definitely get better. We'll make sure of it." 2 days later, I had to go to work. I asked my neighbor to look after Carolina, told her what had happened, and she agreed. My neighbor mentioned that her daughter would be thrilled to have a new friend. I left for work with a heavy heart, thinking about Carolina and her father. It was hard for me to go, but I had to. My first stop was my supervisor's office. She said, "That man from the fire, he's doing okay. Oliver has burns all over his body, but it's temporary. He'll recover. By the way, how's that girl of yours? Everything's fine, and you're responsible for her." I rushed out of the office and into the ward. When I entered, the man was lying with his back to me, probably asleep. I gently touched his shoulder, and he turned around suddenly, his eyes filled with surprise and joy. "Catherine, it's you. You work here? That's great. Listen, do you know who took my Carolina in?" They said it was some nurse. My heart ached. I couldn't believe I was looking at Oliver, my classmate. We sat at the same desk until the 7th grade, but his parents moved away, and we never met again. I had been so upset back then that I even started writing poems about doomed love and a cruel fate of separation. We believed that real, adult love awaited us, one that would last forever. We even kissed once on the lips. After that kiss, I couldn't sleep all night, imagining that we would get married, and I would cook soup while Oliver fixed the television. For some reason, I always thought a good husband should be able to repair a TV, but he didn't leave me his new address. He probably forgot about me quickly in his new place. And here he was, looking at me with a mix of joy and concern, and I finally understood why Carolina had seemed so familiar. She resembled her father a lot. "I have your daughter. Don't worry, you have an amazing daughter, and we've become friends." Oliver smiled and said, "Catherine, thank you. It's like a miracle. You're here, and Carolina is with you. I didn't deserve your help." Back then, our neighborhood friends took me away, and I got into their powerlifting section. I got so absorbed in it that I forgot about everything else. My coach praised me, and I often trained all day long. "I used to think of you, but life went on. I planned to visit you during the holidays and tell you about my victories. I knew you'd forgive me." I finished school, got into college. There, it was all about competitions, and I hardly had any free time. When I got a job, I met Carolina's mother. She was a good person and beautiful. When she found out she was pregnant, we had to hurry and get married. We lived without much love, but we respected each other. They had Carolina, and only after her birth did Oliver's wife's illness progress, and she eventually passed away. Oliver sighed sadly, then smiled. "You've become so beautiful. I'm sure your husband must really love you." I shook my head and said, "There's no husband anymore, in the living sense. He's no longer a part of my life, thank goodness." Oliver comforted me, and I told him, "Get well. We'll see each other again and talk more. I'm staying at work for a day." I left the room, feeling a sense of relief. My heart was light. It turned out that Oliver was a childhood friend, and most importantly, he remembered me for a long time. He was just a naive, headstrong boy, and things turned out the way they did. As for him getting married, that was just life. On that day, we had several more conversations, and the shift flew by unnoticed. The following day, I brought Carolina to the hospital. The girl missed her dad immensely and had a hard time letting go of him. Oliver embraced her so tenderly that I couldn't help but admire it. It's truly heartwarming when a father loves his child so gently. When Oliver was discharged from the hospital, He asked me to let Carolina stay with him temporarily while he found a place to live. I was more than happy to agree. I didn't want to part with the little girl completely, and she had become very attached to me. Oliver was temporarily staying with a friend in the city. I couldn't bring myself to invite him to live with us, and something held me back. He also didn't insist. There was a certain awkwardness between us. Although we both felt a deep, serious connection, it was unsettling. Every day, Oliver came to visit us, helped me with household chores, and we played with Carolina. It was so lighthearted and enjoyable that at times, I became afraid of what would happen when he eventually took Carolina with him. Perhaps our hesitations and uncertainties were what kept us apart. One day, as I was preparing to leave for work for a day-long shift, Carolina suddenly wrinkled her face and exclaimed, "I have a headache. I don't want to leave. What if I get a fever?" Oliver and I were taken aback, and we touched Carolina's forehead, which felt cool. I looked at her with suspicion. She slyly wrinkled her face and plaintively said, "Mom, Catherine, please let Oliver stay." I almost choked when I heard her call me Mom. Of course, Oliver stayed. Nearly 20 years passed. Carolina stood in front of the mirror, nervously adjusting her wedding gown to perfection. Oliver and our younger son peeked through the slightly open doors. I foolishly smiled, wiping away tears of happiness, thinking, so what if my husband can't fix televisions? I have the happiest family in the world.